Welcome to the Shifting Our Schools podcast, where we believe learning never stops. We create innovative and flexible professional development opportunities that support the current research and thinking in education today. This week's podcast episode aspires to set you up to take another step forward on your personal learning journey. Now here's your host, Jeff Udick.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Shifting Schools. So great to be here again with Trisha. Trisha, I think we were just talking before we started recording. Still in the heat wave, but you had a whole day of rain, which is sometimes feels the best, right?
It really did. It's the only day of the entire summer where we've had an all-day rainstorm, and it was just fantastic. I loved it. I loved having that big long rainy day. So maybe that's just again a sign of my age or something. You know, if I were 12 and the whole day was rainy in the summer, I don't think I'd be excited. But middle age, you're like, yes, we need this. The plants need
we need this. Yeah. And I just got back from a great camping trip out on the Washington coast where we hit it perfectly. We had 3 gorgeous days. Got to see, I call them real sunsets, because if you're out at the ocean, a lot of times that cloud layer comes in, and I call those fake sunsets if the sun actually goes behind a cloud. But yeah, we had 3 days. We got to see real sunsets into the ocean. It was beautiful. And it got me thinking, what is the actual percentage of days that happens here in the Northwest? And as I'm thinking about that, it's this idea of today's episode around data literacy and telling data stories becomes so important. There is so much data, and we get into this in today's episode with Alan Hillary, but there's so much data around us. How do we help to tell the data stories? And I just think it's a really great episode as we start thinking about the time and space that we live in right now.
And I think data literacy is only going to become increasingly more and more and more important. And something that Alan goes into on this episode, I think, is also just the reality that a lot of the emerging job markets are looking not at subjects being just in, its own little cubbyhole, but we have to start thinking more holistically, because the work that Alan is talking about is really this merger of lots of different subjects coming together, and the intersection of social justice. As he was talking about his work, he actually reminded me of a TED Talk that's from 2014. So it's actually one of my favorite TED Talks, but I had not thought about it for a long time. It's by Chris Jordan. It is called Turning Powerful Stats into Art. And Alan reminded me of it because he reminded me that when we're facing big problems, or we have information that is just hard to digest and calculate, we need to be really creative in the way in which we are presenting and conveying that data. And that overlap between really the humanities, language arts, all of the different math literacies, it's just, I think, something to be thinking about, because our young learners today are going to also be facing some of those issues where they will have to communicate critical concerns in a way in which I think it has that emotional, that emotional weight from the audience. And I love that he talks about the empathy piece, that a good data communicator will be thinking about what the audience needs to understand and perhaps what the audience needs to feel.
Yeah, and I love that. We really get into this talk about empathy and empathy with data. What do people need to know, and how do I make sure? And it's so interesting, right? We're coming out of the pandemic, and as you reflect back, you think about the scientists and all the data they had coming at them, and then having to put on this empathetic lens of what data is important, right? What is it that people need to know versus what is the googly stuff in the background that people might want to know? And how do you make the want available to those who want it, but make sure that everybody has the information that they need, right? And you've got to put yourself in that situation. And I love it, because that's a real life example of what we're talking about when we're talking about data stories. We're all still living these data stories that are coming out of the CDC or, the Canadian Health Organization Administration. And that's it. It's not just, a bunch of geeky people sitting beside keyboards. Data literacy and data empathy, I think is becoming more and more of our daily life, and just will in the future.
I love that. And, he talks he talks a lot about how data literacy is a literacy or is an emerging core literacy that storytellers are going to need. So I love thinking about that as an educator of how are we leaning into that subset of skills for the storytellers of tomorrow, and really thinking about what are all of the different ways that we need to communicate and why are all of the different reasons that we're going to need that skill set to come together.
Yeah. And I do go on my little rant. Those of you that have listened to the podcast, you'll know that my rant about teaching students spreadsheet skills, I still feel is critically important. We can be teaching kids spreadsheets at very young ages. And we just need, and it comes out again in this episode. Like you listen to, and not just this episode, but all these episodes that we have right here on this idea of data literacy and just the importance of having spreadsheets help us tell numbers, tell the story of numbers. If you want to hear more about that rant, episode 73, The Future Belongs to YouTube and Spreadsheets, is Patrick Green and I going on a rant after doing a training one day. We just hit record and kind of ranted for a little bit on like, this has got to be it. Like we've got to make sure that we are preparing students for their future, not our past. And that future is spreadsheets, one way or the other. You know, whether it's you're balancing your checkbook, which is not in physical form anymore, and you need to know how to look at stuff on an online banking system, or being able to figure out your mortgage rate or whatever it is. It's all data literacy, and it's all done in spreadsheets. So where are we bringing spreadsheets into day-to-day lives of students in schools?
That's right, Jeff, because I think we talk a lot about agency in the world of education. And if students are going to have agency, part of that is going to be, can they curate their own data? Can we tell the stories of the information that's really relevant and personal to us?
Yeah. I love it. It was such a great episode. You've heard us rant on long enough. We're going to turn this over to Alan. So our guest today, Alan Hillary from datastories.cc. You can also follow him on Twitter. Again, all that stuff will be in the show notes. Great episode on data literacy and data storytelling. And with that, on with the show. So great to be here with Trisha and our guest today, Alan, and we're going to be talking all about data literacy. Trisha, let's start with you. I'm going to put you on the spot here. Data literacy. What comes to mind when I say data literacy?
Making sense of numbers. I think demystifying, we talk about being data driven in schools a lot, and reckoning with the reality that the way in which you present data, there's a lot of power in that, right? And I think, my background in education is as a lit teacher, and we talk about building an argument. And the more I've been learning about data literacy is understanding, there is also a way that you can present bias. People think like math is, removed from that. And I feel like the more I learn about data literacy, the more I realize it's sort of a myth. And also just the reality that our data is out there in a way, like our personal information, being scooped up and collected, and having some more awareness about what that means, I think is really, really important.
I love it. Well, we're here today with Alan Hillary from datastories.cc to talk all about data literacy as we gear up for another school year. So, Alan, welcome to the Shifting Schools podcast. Give us a little bit about your background and how did you become interested in data literacy?
Yeah, my background. Thank you again for having me, both you having me. My background is I have an engineering degree. So I went to school for engineering, spent about 3 years out, post undergrad. As an engineer, I evolved more into an analytics role where I was supporting marketing and sales teams. I think that just looking back on everything, I probably should have been a teacher much more sooner than I've become. But, I like training. I like helping. So I've done a lot of analytics work, support. And I would say about 3 years ago, so I'd been in corporate America for about 15 to 20 years. And I decided to make a shift for a lot of various reasons. But as I was beginning to figure out what was next, some of the things I took away, like I just mentioned, that I loved supporting marketing and sales teams. So I got to understand how some people are more familiar, more comfortable with data than others. And then, of course, there are some people who, while they may not be labeled a data person, they were very familiar with the data because they had the business context and know what they're looking for. So all of that, just looking back on some of those reflections and also just wanting to give back to underserved communities, or just to give back from an educational standpoint, I realized that there is a need to help people become more familiar with data. And also, after doing countless presentations, corporate presentations, trying to make sure that everyone understood what I was talking about, I realized that there was a need to kind of maybe refine that some more. So one of the first steps I took while I was during the end of my tenure in my corporate job, I was teaching data storytelling. And so that really lit a fire inside of me, like, oh, this is something I really would like to do. And because I know a lot of people have struggled with trying to either understand analysis or even to get people to understand it as coming from a data perspective. So that's what has definitely been putting me on this mission.
Awesome.
Thank you again for joining us. And Alan, I feel like I owe you an apology for me trying to talk about data literacy, like me trying to explain basketball to Sue Bird for a moment there. So thank you for bearing with me as I spoke about it.
No, I think, it's fine.
But again, your expertise and your level of experience with data, I really appreciate you talking about how you've pivoted, and the work that you're doing, as it seems to me as an outsider, is trying to inspire others to really think about the ways in which they can tell data stories. Yes. That phrase might be unfamiliar to some of our listeners, so I'm wondering if you could first walk us through the process of what it means to create a data story, and then maybe talk to us a little bit about why we need more data storytellers.
Yeah, so creating a data story is more or less, I like to call it balancing narrative in data. So a lot of times, not a lot of times, but we're in a time where there's just such an influx of data, and it can't just stay necessarily in the professionals' hands. It can't be as siloed as it used to be with data professionals assisting. I think, there comes a time where it's kind of all hands on deck. And so when you have a data story, a lot of stories can be told, and it's just adding those numbers. One of the classes that I taught at, we talked about Aristotle's triangle. So when you're trying to create a persuasive argument, you want to have a balance of like logos, ethos, and pathos, where logos is the words, ethos is that ethics or that street cred, and pathos is the feeling or the emotion. So a lot of times we have a lot of topics that need data to support them, just to kind of appeal to a broader audience. Like a lot of times you may have like social justice issues, or you may be trying to, from a corporate perspective, you're trying to fight for a certain product that's maybe new to the market. And so you want to be able to have numbers to back it up. So that's in a nutshell. Like when you're trying to tell a data story, you're just trying to balance numbers and narratives, as well as that emotional aspect, because we all think differently. Some of us are more numbers forward. Some of us are going to be more emotion, be more creative or think more emotionally stronger that way. So you try to, if you balance a story, the goal is that you're telling an effective story.
What I'm hearing here is like this massive overlap between data math class, if we take it, and ELA, Trisha. We have so many standards around persuasive writing in the ELA program. And really, what Alan's talking about is like, how do you take those arguments that you learn in ELA and apply those with a data lens? I just love that integration as we start thinking about another school year of like, where does ELA meet math, in these data stories?
Well, and, I'm thinking even too, holistically, and I don't know, Alan, if this would really qualify as a data story or not, but I'm thinking of a TED Talk that came out like over 10 years ago, so bear with me. I think the artist is Chris Jordan, and what he was trying to do was put environmental issues, really present them in a way that was captivating, but also was a big call to action. And so he would have these portraits, and the one that I'm thinking of is, you look at it at first and it really just looks like lines on a canvas, and then he keeps zooming out, zooming out, zooming out. And what it was a visualization of how many plastic cups are used just by airlines every day.
Wow.
And, when he zooms way out, it really is, as you were talking about, that pathos, like just that feeling of, wow, like it, kind of gives you chills, the scale of the waste. And in a way, he could have just said it's, however many millions of cups. And I don't know, if that would have just struck the chord with me in the same way as that visualization did.
No, I think that's totally a great example of what I would call a data story, because yes, you could have quoted the millions of cups, but we can't really, most of us cannot visualize what a million looks like, or, so like if you can see something with the pathos trying to relate to your audience, because knowing your audience is also very important too, to make sure you do strike those right chords. So I totally agree that definitely qualifies.
Whew. Okay, great. Sweet relief. Alan, you're also the co-founder of Be Data Lit, and we'll link to a recent episode of your Be Data Lit podcast where you discuss the ways that data literacy is going to be important in the future of work, and perhaps important in the present state of work too. Could you point us to what K-12 educators need to know about the link between data literacy and just emerging trends in the job market? Because, I would probably struggle to even name 5 different career paths that are possible through data literacy, but I know that there's many, many more than just 5.
Right. No, I mean, this is definitely a conversation I've had many times. It's like, I feel like, the educational system needs to evolve a bit. And in terms of that, because a lot of times we do look at data careers, we're thinking of like data scientists, or we're thinking of maybe analytical people. So outside looking in, but I have peeked in a little bit. When it comes to K-12 education, the tracks is like, well, if you're going to be that type of quote unquote person, then you're going to have more math, you're going to have more science. I know for me, when I did engineering in college, there were some requirements to do humanities, but it wasn't heavy. And I don't remember having to write papers like some of my other colleagues had to do. So I say all that to say, it's like, when we do come out into the world, just the gap that we are seeing is when people are looking to analyze data. It's not necessary. I like to call 2 things. Like there's data wrangling when you're trying to analyze, you're trying to set up databases and things of that nature. But when it comes to trying to understand the trends, explain them to people who may not be as data versed or, literate, there's a gap there because, sometimes the analyst can't always tell that story or communicate in a way that's going to get the attention of a decision maker or get the attention of someone else who may not be as data literate. And so, a lot of companies are looking at liberal arts majors because they do have what we call they can kind of derive that context or they have the critical thinking skills, that we call. And so they're able to express or articulate a little bit better. So that's definitely one of the things, getting back to your question, is like when it comes to going through a schooling or a training path, it's just making sure that students understand that they don't necessarily have to be the one who's going to be doing the heavy calculations, but at the same time, just being able to hone those skills. But even if you are going to be that person who plans to be the analyst, just keeping us to labels to make life easier, you just need to be able to also be taught some of those skills too, where you can kind of be able to explain what you're thinking, to explain the analysis, to be able to maybe identify, okay, this audience is looking for a particular outcome. They're not looking for the whole data dump or every little insight that I pick on. We need to try to train ourselves to be intuitive, to understand, okay, this person wants me to highlight this or spotlight that. So I don't know if that helped, but that's what
I was just thinking, one of my good friends here, he actually is in marketing, and his company actually sells cables and antennas to like T-Mobile, AT&T to make your cell phone work. That's basically how I understand his job, right? But really what he is like, as I'm hearing you talk, I mean, he is constantly looking at the numbers and what numbers, like he runs the T-Mobile account. So like what numbers does T-Mobile want? He's got all kinds of data, but it's like understanding and learning, like, no, T-Mobile is really passionate about these numbers. How do I make sure that I'm giving them the numbers? There's so much data. And he talks about this, like he had to learn this over time. The first couple times he was doing presentations, it was just way too much data. It was just like, he was giving them everything and they were like, whoa, we just want these 3 things. And so it's, to your point, like you have to understand your audience to know, okay, which data is relevant to them the moment they want that data. Otherwise, you just overwhelm people with data that they don't need or don't want, or you sit there waiting for the data that you want, and now people get, then they're not ready to receive it. I don't know. I just think there's a lot there when you just from a marketing day-to-day, like his day-to-day job is basically knowing what data do I need to tell the production team, what data does T-Mobile need to know, what data does my boss need to know, and understanding how to tell those stories to keep things, moving down the line. So
yeah, definitely a difference between data exploration and like data, like exploring data. That's something that you do as an analyst, but then you want to explain or give that insight. So that's when you have to know when, okay, it's kind of like in one of my classes, we talk about, every audience doesn't want to know how you went fishing for oysters. They just want to know what your best pearls are. So
I love that.
So it's like the best pearls is just giving those insights.
I love that.
I wonder, there's been kind of this theme in some of our recent conversations on this podcast about so-called soft skills. And what I feel like I hear you saying is that curiosity and empathy are really crucial to the work that you do. But correct me if I'm wrong. Am I way off base with that? Or, would you say that folks who are working in your field, those are so-called soft skills that need to be harnessed or learned, or maybe, I wonder if that was sort of an entry point or an interest for you early on in your career.
Yeah, I think that's a 2-part question. I do believe that a 2-part answer rather. I do believe that there is definitely that sharpening of what we call soft skills in the industry. Like I do feel like there can be data professionals who can pick up on those soft skills that I just mentioned. But I also argue that some of these, a lot of data professionals who go into the business, especially if they're looking to be, data wranglers, what I call them, with databases and things, they may not have really signed up to be the person to have to be in front of those meetings talking to people. So that's where I say that we do need to have what I call data empathy, understanding how people are going to use data across an organization. Understand that there's some people who may not be the ones doing the heavy lifting, but they need to just either become a little bit more trained in being familiar with data enough, because in terms of corporations, a lot of our business owners have that business context. So they do know what they're looking for, but they may sometimes be hesitant because we've gone through educational systems where, okay, I'm the marketing manager, I'm the business manager, I'm not the data person. So that some people may actually be more, like I was saying earlier, familiar with data, but it doesn't mean that they need to be the ones doing all the heavy calculations. So there is that term, what I call having empathy, understanding how everyone's going to use the data, who does what, and it's identifying people's talents. Like some people are really good at analyzing, really good at describing trends, but their strong suit may not be the one who's writing the code to disseminate the data, but they can definitely sit with the data and tell really great insights and stories.
All right, last question for you, because it's on my mind, and I'd like to know your opinion on this. How important is it to be teaching students how to use a spreadsheet?
It's very important.
And here's why I say this. I mean, you were going on and on about this data stuff, and if you look at our standards, there aren't very many standards that say students use a spreadsheet to create a graph, or students use a spreadsheet to take really big numbers and make meaning from it. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's some of the shift I would love to see in the educational system, is to have more of that practical use
100%
uses of data, because again, when at Be Data Lit, we talk about data literacy even outside of our jobs. That there are a lot of people, generations where we're looking up information like our banking information, insurance information. We're doing that online, and especially with the pandemic, we were forced to do it more. So everyone is not familiar with that. So there's definitely so many different dynamics with the use of data and how we should be familiar with it.
I love that. And if you want to hear more about my personal rant on that, it's episode 73, where I talk about the future belongs to YouTube and spreadsheets. And we've just got to do more, I think, around that. And as you're talking, there was an article that came out that was like, what was it? Like top 10 skills for boomers that Gen Xers don't use or won't use. And one of them was balancing a checkbook. Right? Like nobody has a checkbook anymore. And like the register in your checkbook. But what do Gen X have? They have Excel, they've got Sheets, they've got Mint.com. All of these are spreadsheets. That's what they are. They're spreadsheets. Like you need to understand what a CSV file is. So when I go to my bank, it says download a CSV file. Great. If I open that CSV file, it looks like gibberish. I upload it into Sheets or Excel and I'm like, here's all my information and my purchases and I can balance it.
Yeah, I was literally having this conversation with my co-founder, Sarah, at Be Data Lit because, we were, I was in a part of my life journey where I was caregiving for my mom and my aunt. And so, I wanted them to still kind of do their day to day without me fully taking it over. So, yeah, I had to sometimes help with writing checks. And I'm like, you feel free to laugh, but there were moments I had to Google like how to make sure how to write the checks because I just want to make sure that I'm doing this right because I pay bills online. So
yeah, right.
So totally to your point.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Alan, thank you for being here with us. If people want to learn more about you, follow you, get more information, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, you can definitely start with Twitter. So I'm Al DataViz Guy. So at Al DataViz Guy, definitely follow me on LinkedIn. I definitely would love people to follow us at Data Stories. We have a lot of workshops for educators that we're looking to launch this coming fall. So definitely check that out. And those three places are a good place to start. And if you catch me on Twitter, I'll definitely reach out and respond to you.
Very cool. And we'll make sure all of that's in the show notes. Yeah, we'll make sure all that's in the show notes. Thank you for spending some time with us today to really start focusing this light. The thing I love about August podcasts and 1st of September podcasts is this is stuff we start thinking about this stuff as educators. How do I change that one little lesson? How do I make sure I'm having kids tell the story of data? Not just come up with the data, but what does that data tell me? That's such a simple little question to tell. Even at the end of your assessment, you just did all this data. What does that data tell me, right? Start writing those data stories. Alan, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and energy for being here. And we'll make sure all those links are in the show notes. That's datastories.cc to follow Alan, and then his Twitter account and everything else will be over there too. Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Shifting Our Schools. If you found this episode helpful or inspiring, please make sure to subscribe and leave the team a 5-star rating. If you want to learn more about the Shifting Schools team or download our free resources, head over to shiftingschools.com to see what's on offer now. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week for another episode to keep rethinking the shifts our schools need.